My name is Jean Gerber, and from 1987 to 94, I was the Director of Community Planning and Services with the Federation. It was the first years of the Federation, and I was the first planning director.
And what kind of challenges did that pose? What kind of issues were, the top of the ladder for you back then?
Well, I guess if we'd known what a big job it was, I might not have even taken the job, because it really was quite challenging. The organizations had very little sense of community planning, what that meant for their agency, because we also did allocations for all the constituent agencies. They had no idea what that was. They had no demographic data on which to base their planning and programming, but more importantly, they had no sense of themselves as part of a whole community continuum of services. So we had to get over that hump, first of all. Secondly, the data I mentioned, there was no demographic data that people used in their planning. So we used the census, the Canadian census, and it worked very well because they do a special run for the Jewish community of Canada. And what we did then was to be able to provide some basis for any agency's planning. For example, poverty. Nobody really knew how big an issue it was. It was about 15%, I think, poverty at that time, the first time we looked at it, and I think it's still pretty much like that, sadly. But at least now organizations know it's an issue. So, for example, when I first brought my demographic report to the board, I have to say one of my friends on the board came to me and said he'd never heard such nonsense. And I thought, well, we'll just soldier on with the data because it isn't nonsense. It's going to turn out to be vital, and it was. Another challenge was the growth of the community outside Vancouver. So places like Richmond, the North Shore, the eastern suburbs around Burnaby, these were growing. And there was a real sense in Vancouver and the Vancouver-based agencies that that's all there was, Vancouver. And so we needed to get them interested. We needed to get the Federation involved in planning with those new communities. One of the attitudes was that if you really wanted to be part of the Jewish community, you would live in Vancouver. And we know now, of course, how unrealistic that was as a solution. And so those communities needed some work. I was working for Canadian Jewish Congress as their associate director, dealing with community issues like anti-Semitism, Holocaust education, things like that. And I left that position. I enrolled in a master's program at UBC, and immediately Steve Drysdale called me up to say, would you come in for an interview? And so I took the job. So that's how it happened. I knew some other people and immediately supported by so many others. I think it was a rewarding moment in my life. I learned so much, and when I left Federation, I took those skills with me elsewhere.
Are there any particular events, stories, achievements, or anything that really stand out for you?
Yes, several. One was our big project, Services for Seniors. We got a $250,000 grant from the government, and we did a needs assessment of the current needs, seniors programs, and then, met with seniors representatives from the agencies to find out what was missing. And in the 2 years, I guess, the project ran, we really, really achieved a lot. We started with the Seniors Advisory Council. You now have a Seniors Alliance that does advocacy and peer support and all kinds of other programs. We started funding an adult daycare center here at the Jewish Community Center. JFSA has some programs that it began to run. It was really a big project, and it was extremely successful. Another challenge we had, which I maybe didn't mention yet, another challenge we had was the influx of Jews from the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so one of the first times we sat every agency in the city down with a targeted population. We got a really nice what's the word I'm looking for? A really nice settlement program for the people who were coming in. So we had all the schools, we had synagogues, we had the center, we had JFSA, and we actually put together a resettlement project, a program that worked very well. And it was one of the first times that all these agencies had actually sat down and targeted a population.
You were saying there was another challenge?
Yes. Well, there were two, actually. One was intermarriage. There was a big report that was done nationally on intermarriage in the Jewish community, or would that be outside the Jewish community? And we did what I would call an attitudinal survey of people. We worked with a graduate student at UBC to put this together, and so we tried to find out some people's attitudes towards their Jewishness, what their attitude, what they believed was good, what they actually did. And then we spun that into meetings and committees that started working on intermarried couples. There was a forum on intermarriage that JFSA ran that was an offshoot of this. Also, I mentioned the suburban communities, and there was, well, again, we didn't have the information on how many children and young adults were actually in Jewish educational institutions of some sort, a camp, a day school, an after school. So with that information, we were able to see how Jewish education across community lines could be achieved. I couldn't say that was a total success in that not every institution wanted to collaborate with every other. But eventually we got a day school started in Richmond. As you know, Richmond Jewish Day School is now up and operating. And I think that although only a few supplementary schools were being funded, it's my understanding that now they all receive some funding from Federation, which is a very important step forward if you're looking at Jewish education as a whole. The community itself, when we started, did not really have a sense of itself as an organism, as a unified organism that will serve different populations but with all the same goal. And I think that that has begun to be addressed. I think that the allocations process is much better. When we started, it was, you know, first this agency comes in and then that agency comes in, and its advocates argue for that amount of money. But I think that now, with a 2-year funding allocation process, that helps quite a lot for these institutions to plan ahead. And now they are used to, they're happy to get the data that comes out of a demographic study or any other kind of community survey. And these efforts, which are communal and cohesive, I think bind the community together in a way that it was not before Federation came along. I think that working with all the different agencies that I did over the years, the major ones like JFSA, the schools, seeing them grow and prosper has been very satisfying. And, you know, those of us who started out with Federation like to think that we had some effect, and that what we tried to do in terms of planning, in terms of increasing allocations where a particular population was in need, I think that's a very satisfying thing to see. And I think that it started, of course, from the day we moved here from back east, the east coast of the United States. I think you've probably heard this before, but when we would have a meeting, one of the things people said was, okay, all the people who were born in Vancouver, stand up. Maybe 2 people stood up out of 10. And now just seeing the young people, my children's ages, taking over, that's very satisfying, because that means that they acquired a very passionate feeling for the community. I think part of my work when I worked at Congress was with survivors of the Holocaust. And I think they taught me a lot about a community, its strengths and its weaknesses, and what a person can bring to it. So if that's where it comes from in my case, I guess that's where it comes from. We started out with, I guess you could call them known populations. There's a population of seniors. There's a population of immigrants from a particular country. We did a little work with what was then called disabilities, for people with special needs, whatever that category is. And as I said, we started with the three suburban communities that were growing the most. So now Federation has, has extended all that quite a bit. So now they're reaching out to Maple Ridge and Abbotsford and Langley and places like that where Jews have to move because the housing is so very expensive, even in the near suburbs, never mind the city of Vancouver. And that's a very important outreach to me, and I see that as a continuation of Federation. And the other thing is dealing with special populations. I don't know what to call them. Let's say populations that nobody paid any attention to for a long time, like the LGBTQ population, lesbian, gay, trans, queer populations. This is a big center for people like that. And Jews who are part of that world, or parents or children who are part of that world, I think really were overlooked for a very long time, and I think that's a really good outreach. So I see Federation as expanding into populations that have been bypassed by the community as a whole, and I think that is a very great strength for Federation, but also for our community in general.